In the late 90s, there was a study done in Scotland and United Kingdom, and it was published in a book called, let me see if I've got the right name for it, Eccentrics, a Study of Sanity and Strangeness. Eccentrics. And what they were interested in, it was a couple of Scottish doctors, and what they were interested in looking at, well, what is the difference between someone who we might describe as eccentric and someone we might describe as mentally ill? What's the difference between the two? Can we tell what's different between them? And so they were really interested in that question of what makes someone eccentric as opposed to someone who might be labeled as mentally ill. And so they did this great big study where they sought out people who their family and friends, it was kind of a rolling kind of methodology to identify all these people throughout England and Scotland who their family and friends described as eccentric. And so they found a guy who was a potato inspector who just was so in love with the idea of potatoes. He knew its history. His house was decorated with all kinds of potatoes, and he knew all the uses, and he was very eccentric around potatoes. They identified one of the eccentrics they interviewed was a man who believed that if you did that chess, the game of chess, was actually an access into deep spiritual knowledge. So he would play chess all the time, all day long. Play more chess in a week than people would play in their lifetime because he felt like it gave him a deep spiritual insight into his life, into the world. There was a gentleman in a small village in Scotland who believed he was the king of Scotland, would walk around with a crown in this small town, providing blessings to everyone around him. And the community kind of went along and bowed down whenever he passed by. So they identified all these folks who were eccentric. And they did some various tests and interviews and conversations. And they found some very interesting things. What they found, one of the things they found, what was interesting, it's kind of an aside to what I'm talking about this morning, but one of the things they found is actually women and people of color are more often than not allowed to be eccentric. That the word eccentric, more often than not, was not applied to women and people of color. And what they found was people who, these eccentrics, in which they gave some testing, psychological testing, which they often did with schizophrenics and that kind of thing, that actually, according to these psychological tests at the time, you really couldn't tell a difference between a person who said they were eccentric and a person who was labeled as mentally ill, according to the current testing. And what they discovered, interesting enough, is really the only difference between a person who was labeled eccentric, odd, out of the ordinary, unique, and a person who was labeled as mentally ill. The only difference was the eccentric was happy. Was happy with themselves. That the most significant difference between being eccentric and being labeled mentally ill or understanding oneself in that way is that these eccentrics had joy in their differentness. That in fact, one of the interesting things as they studied this population is actually people who were eccentric, out of the ordinary, different, were happier than the general population. And in fact, not only happier, they were healthier. And what was interesting about the study and the writing about it and the conversation about it was that in many ways, by giving up on the social pressure, these social norms to behave in a certain way, They found a freedom and a meaning in their lives. They were comfortable with being so different. And the writers on this study say, you know, what's interesting is the truth is most of us spend too much time worried about fitting into the norms, and we're afraid of being called eccentric. I found that fascinating, our fear of being eccentric. And the fact is, there are certain people who find joy in their eccentricity. Now, in the mishmash of that scripture in which Jesus is praying to God and speaking to his disciples, there's really a basic theme that comes through that theologians identify. It says that you as disciples are supposed to be in the world, but not of the world. That's repeated a number of times. The church is supposed to be in the world, but different from the world, and not of it. Modern day theologians say, you know, what's interesting is we as a church, that we've kind of reversed that now. We're more of the world than we are in it. We're more reflective of the world even as we retreat from it. But what Jesus is trying to communicate, I think, at a level that they can understand, is you are supposed to be an eccentric community. I mean, who was more eccentric than Jesus, right? Right? Who is more odd and outside the norm than Jesus? Afro-Palestinian peasant who had no power, yet challenged all those who had power. A man who hung out with women and lepers and tax collectors and everyone who was considered outside God's grace. What's more eccentric than that? Who told these stories, these strange stories that didn't make a lot of sense, but tried to lead us into seeing the world. He essentially was so eccentric, he turned the world upside down. And in many ways, in John's gospel, in many ways in these words shared, what is trying to be conveyed is this idea that you're supposed to be eccentric as a church. You're supposed to be different. Maybe a church that reflects that same sense of connecting to those who are been previously excluded. Maybe the same kind of church that isn't about power, but challenges those in power. Maybe it's a different kind of church that reflects who Jesus is. But what struck me about this passage is the truth is, I think, one of the most eccentric things Jesus points to, it's just a line in there in which he tells this community of disciples that my joy will be complete in you. It's a line in there. And it's kind of an odd line. As if saying, you're so eccentric that the basis of your eccentricity is joy. And that struck me as I read this, that in many ways, what's supposed to make us different is that we're a community of joy. Not some somber bunch, but a joyful community. And why is that so eccentric these days, I wonder? Now, it's not some false joy. It's not some pie-in-the-sky, Pollyannish kind of vision, somewhere over the rainbow kind of idea. It's a community rooted in Jesus that brings true joy. And what's more expressive or eccentric in this world today, in this time when we open our newspapers or look on the internet and we just look at the world and it frightens us. And we're afraid, despair, hopeless maybe, afraid of each other. How eccentric would it be to be a community of joy? Joyfully welcoming the stranger, joyfully welcoming the homeless person, joyfully welcoming and connecting to each other, no matter how different we are, or how different we may come at the world or understand the world. How eccentric is it to be in a world that has so little joy in it? So little real joy. We have a lot of manufactured joy, so little real joy. Now, obviously this is Mother's Day, so I had to struggle this week with how to connect the sermon to Mother's Day. Because if I don't, I'll get in trouble and feel less joy. But what struck me, I know, and I've shared before, my mother has passed away over 2 years ago. And I know my wife and I were talking, she lost her mother the same year I did, and in that we talked about what we miss, about not having our mothers in our lives physically anymore. And what struck me about was that one of the gifts my mom gave me, and I hopefully most of your moms were able to, or someone in your life who served as a mother, one of the gifts, one of the things I missed the most is whenever I would go home, she would just be so happy I was there. That there was this human being in the world that was joyfully welcoming me just because I was alive. In many ways, that's what a mom is, or a dad, or someone that we love deeply, is someone who just joyfully greets us and is joyful because you're alive in the world. And if we don't get that experience with a parent or someone else in our lives, we miss out on something so important. And if we don't offer that to another human being, the sense not what they can do for us, or that they agree with us, or that they do everything we expect, but just that experience of grace where I'm just glad to see you because you're alive and you're a gift. And how eccentric is that in the world today, if you think about it? To have those kinds of relationships where people love us just for being alive and being here. Maybe if we are that kind of community, that kind of eccentric joy, the world can be changed. Maybe it's the only way the world can be changed. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.